Hello and welcome to American Talk. I'm Tom Switzer. Well, we all know that the US security alliance has been the centrepiece of Australian foreign policy for several decades, and this year marks the 60th anniversary of the special relationship between Canberra and Washington. But surprisingly, very little is known about the history between the two nations. To provide some historical context, I'm joined today by the distinguished historian James Curran, who's also a research associate here at the United States Study Centre. And James, I just thought I'd start by saying that the conventional wisdom, I think, in the community is that the alliance has been pretty much the sacred cow of Australian foreign policy since wartime in 1941, when the Labor Prime Minister, John Curtin, famously looked to America. This was just after Pearl Harbor and on the eve of the fall of Singapore. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it?
It certainly is. I mean, yes, that myth about John Curtin forging the US alliance in the midst of those dramatic circumstances of late 1941 and early 1942 does have a very tenacious grip on the Australian folk imagination. Now, obviously, the security treaty with the United States was signed 10 years later in 1951, but certainly it has a longer history. That is the attempt by Australian leaders on both sides of politics to enjoin America in the defence of Australia and to get America firmly anchored in the Pacific.
You've just written a book about John Curtin and his envisioning of a post-war order. Now, he developed very close relations with President Eisenhower and General Douglas MacArthur, who was stationed here in Australia during a lot of that period. Nevertheless, he was turning to Britain in 43-44. Why?
Well, there were nothing in John Curtin's wartime statements, I believe, which would lead you to believe that he previewed a long security relationship with the United States. Certainly, there's no doubt that, like Deakin, Lyons and Menzies before him, Curtin looked to America to guarantee Australia's defence, and in these perilous circumstances, he had no other option. But that call to America was a moment, I think, of pure expediency arising out of survivalist anxiety. He knew that following the fall of Singapore, that there was not so much a need to junk the old imperial defence scheme, but to reinvigorate it, to bolster it, to make it work better to protect Australian interests. So that's why you see, from mid-1943, once the real danger of invasion has passed, John Curtin sets about in a very patient, orderly way of convincing his party and his people that Australia's future is as part of the British Commonwealth. Now, there is what you might call an old Praetorian Guard of Australian historians who simply do not want to face up to the fact that Curtin, had a British race patriot outlook on the world. But this is not to say Curtin was some sort of obsequious, genuflecting toady. He wanted the empire to work better for Australian interests.
Sure. And after all, he was a creature of Australian culture. So he was hardly alone, presumably, when he was looking to Britain in 43-44.
That's right. And look, even during the war, Arthur Corbell, who was then Minister for Information, was saying things like, look, Britain is finished. In the post-war world, they're going to be the big powers, the Americans, the Soviets, and we are going to have to basically understand that the future of the empire is in the dominions, like Australia.
Now, after the war, so from 1945, it takes a good 6 years before a formal security alliance is signed between Washington and Canberra. Why did it take so long when you had the Truman Doctrine of containment enunciated, you had the Communist Revolution in China, the early stages of the Korean War, not to mention all sorts of communist insurgencies starting to rear their ugly head? Why did it take so long for Canberra and Washington to develop that close security relationship in 51?
Well, I think for the very simple fact that the Americans, when they looked out at Asia in the immediate post-war period, it did not have the same imperative as the European situation in order to construct a security alliance to contain communism. Now, it's certainly true that the Evatt and, of course, the Chifley government tried to involve the Americans in a mutual defence pact in this period. The Americans weren't interested. Then Evatt tried to get them to agree to the mutual use of joint bases in the Pacific. The Americans weren't interested. Then, at the last ditch, he tried to get a presidential statement of support. Again, he was rebuffed by the Americans. Why? Because they weren't worried about Japan. Australia was still worried about a resurgent Japan. The Americans had the Japanese under control. They were occupying the country. So
to a liberal democracy and rebuild it.
That's right.
Yeah.
But the Australians, as I think McMahon Ball said, were a bit slower to get into the Cold War mindset. They were still fighting the Second World War. The Americans were trying to convince them that there's a possibility of a Third World War coming. What really changes, I think, Tom, is the transformation in the United States East Asia policy, and that comes about as a result of a number of factors, some of which you just mentioned. The Berlin blockade, Russia getting the Soviets getting the bomb, and also when the communist North Koreans invade South Korea. And suddenly the imperative and the rationale for a NATO-style security alliance in Asia is much more compelling. Sure. And that's when the Americans start the negotiations.
There's no question there is a very close geopolitical relationship between Canberra and Washington during the height of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, but there are nevertheless some tensions. Can you explain some of those tensions for us?
Yes, well, I think right from the outset of the signing of the treaty, I mean, you only need to look at the language of Article 4 and the way in which the Americans wrote about this. I mean, Dulles wrote to MacArthur, and he said that Article 4 shows that the United States can discharge its obligations under this treaty in any way and in any area that it sees fit. Now, the Americans simply were not, quite rightly, going to give over or allow smaller powers like Australia to complicate their own policies and processes. So it's not surprising that Australia didn't get the access and the intimacy it wanted. But look, there were, I think, some very important episodes that happened, I mean, in the 50s and 60s, which showed that as much as Australian and American interests coincided, as much as Robert Menzies, the Prime Minister at the time, could say that Australians had to fit themselves for close cooperation with the United States and Southeast Asia, when the push came to the shove, when Australia had its own particular regional interests that arose out of its own geopolitical anxieties, the Americans didn't see them through the same lens. Right. And over West New Guinea in particular.
This is in 1962?
Well, this is really running from, I mean, West New Guinea is the great unresolved issue after the Indonesians gained their independence, with, of course, Australian and American goodwill, but it's the sore that continues to fester throughout the 1950s and is really only resolved towards the end of the Kennedy administration. Now, you know, the Australians feared that if the Indonesians got hold of what was called Dutch New Guinea, that they wouldn't stop there, that they would take over the Australian territory of Papua New Guinea. And they were also quite concerned that the Indonesians were going to go communist. But the prime rationale for Australia's opposition to Indonesia gaining control was this fear of Indonesian expansionism.
What about the Vietnam War? Now, the coalition governments of Prime Ministers Robert Menzies and Harold Holt and John Gorton and Bill McMahon were staunch supporters of the Vietnam War. But the Labor Party in opposition at that time, and remember the Labor Party was in opposition from 49 until 72, what was their position towards the Vietnam War?
Well, I mean, overwhelmingly one of opposition. I mean, they may have started out by agreeing with the essentials of the policy, but with the commitment of the Australian Battalion in April of '65, the Labor Party leader Caldwell came out and said that the government had misinterpreted the nature of the conflict, that in fact this was a nationalist-inspired movement, not a communist one, and that it was not the role of Australia as an ally to keep pushing America into these sort of adventures, that this was not the role that an ally should play. So there's no doubt that the Australian governments at that time did not follow America out of blind protection. They wanted to keep the Americans engaged in Southeast Asia, and in fact they pressed the Americans to continue the fight. Yeah. Now, the question is, what does Australia gain? Even if it's a flawed assessment of Australia's interests in the region, it's still a distinctive Australian policy. Australia saw its own interests bound up in keeping the Americans engaged in Southeast Asia. Certainly, as a reward, President Johnson came to Australia in October '66.
This was on the eve of a national election in Australia.
That's right, and the Liberal Party increased its majority. It must be one of, if not the biggest landslide in Australian political history. But it might be said that this was perhaps the only victory that Holt could get out of the war.